I really enjoyed the third episode very, very much. I thought it was a very. I finally enjoyed it very much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you
I've
halfway enjoyed the other
I've
two.
been enjoying the other two, but
Okay.
more for the things that they evoke rather than for
Yeah.
the show itself being something that I really, really like. You know what I mean?
Okay.
As a project, I have been really enjoying it, and I've been enjoying sort of examining it and trying to think about it. But this episode is finally, I feel, getting into beyond the sort of just calf deep waters and really, really wading into some interesting stuff. And it's pretty scary at the end, actually. It was about
And
1:30 in the morning, and it was a little spooky. I was worried that
yeah,
some dude, some naked guy in a diaper was gonna come into my bedroom.
yeah, I'm not there. I'm in Spain. I can't do it anymore.
Yeah, well, he couldn't either, but he did it nonetheless. People who live far away from civilization will do things and wear things that most other people won't. And I think that you
Yeah.
start to, if the farther you are from civilization, the more you
Oh
become.
yeah.
Do you become more like you really are, or do you become I guess a parody of yourself because you kind of start to let everything go because there are no social checks on you. Is it you? Is it who you really are deep down that you become if you live in the woods 10 kilometers from anybody else, or is it that you become a caricature of your real self, which was maybe the city dwelling person?
Hmm. I don't know. The only I think you've had sort of isolating experiences. I mean, I've had the one where I was on the west coast of Ireland for a month, pretty much all alone in a big like house,
What were you,
all alone. Huh?
what were you doing there?
I was just there traveling, and I was in a hostel, and I was there alone, and
It was a hostel with only one guest.
well, it was me. I was just hanging out there, kind of looking after it, and just
Oh,
I
you were
had the
looking
space.
after the hostel, and nobody wanted to stay there. No,
It,
there were
it
no
was
guests.
yeah, not like nobody goes out there to that part of Ireland in the wintertime.
Ah,
So
so it was like The Shining.
yeah, in many many ways. So the first, I think, few days I was out there, it was pretty unnerving because you walk outside. It's so dark when you walk outside, and you can't. There's no stars in the sky, and you can't see your hand in
Because it's
front of your
so
face.
overcast. Why? Because
I think it was overcast, yeah.
yeah,
And it's
yeah.
just inky black. And then it's a big compound. And I was just, kind of hanging out, looking after it. And uh, yeah, I was out there all alone. And for about 10 days, I saw next to nobody. And then there were some people that live around, and I'd see them drive by every once in a while, but never really talk to them. But then occasionally a neighbor or something would come around, and I would
Mm,
talk to them. And when I would talk to them, I realized later how excited I was to talk to a human being.
mm.
After 3 or 4 days of just being totally alone, and then being in that big space by myself, it was kind of scary to begin with because
I would
I'm
imagine
thinking,
so.
yeah, it's got these kind of long hallways and big rooms that are just empty and dark. And so I was thinking, God, if I asked a question into the darkness, I'd probably get an answer. I'd probably
There'd be
hear something.
somebody hiding behind the drapes or something would just whisper, maybe, or something like that, whatever it
Yeah,
would be. And that, yeah, because that's a scary thought, right? Being
yeah,
alone in a place. I don't know what it is about being alone and being in darkness that even as an adult, it can be scary. It shouldn't be because it's illogical, right? So last night I finished watching episode 3, and by the way, if people watching this haven't seen episode 3 of True Detective season 1, then you should do that first, because that's what we're talking about. Otherwise, you'll be just, what's the point, right? So watch that first. But after watching that, there's a kind of a scary moment at the end. Well, not terrifying or anything, but there's this weird dude in a diaper type thing, covered in tattoos, with crazy blonde hair, and has a World War I style gas mask on, probably has been making meth or something. And he just walks out into this sort of deserted area from this very strange looking, weird looking sort of compound in the middle of nowhere. And then it ended, and I was sort of there in bed watching it, and was just alone in the dark. And I just looked over at the door, and I thought, what if that person just walked into my room? That would be terrifying. And it's a very childish fear because it's irrational. And yet as a 22-year-old man, which I am, I was for a few minutes really scared. I don't know what that is. When you were there in Ireland, was that something that you got used to? Did you sort of embrace it after a while?
Yeah, so the first 10 days were kind of unnerving, and then I was back in civilization for about 3 days, and then I went back out to that area, and it was heaven. It was amazing. Just whatever difference being back around people made for the 3 days I left that place, and then coming back to that place after civilization, I don't know. It was amazing. It was heaven on earth. Just quiet. Solitude was fine. I was walking around in the dark in the big spaces and no problems at all. But psychologically, the first part of that stay was really unnerving. And maybe it was because right before that, I was around people all the time. And so you've got, I think to your point about being in civilization, when you're around other people, you're kind of bouncing your own ideas off of other human beings.
Even subconsciously, right? Even if it's just behavior. It's not really ideas, it's behavior. Yeah,
there's so much feedback, right, that goes, or that happens when you're just around other humans. And then when you're, maybe detaching from that was the scary part, and just sort of then only having your own thoughts to deal with.
It may be an interesting side effect, the transition period. People report similar things. People who, for example, hike the Appalachian Trail, they say that it's pretty scary for the first few days. I have a friend who did it, and he said for the first few days it was pretty scary. Just being alone at night and knowing that the Mothman is out there, But then it sort of just becomes part of you, and you get used to it, and the fear subsides. But I can't imagine sleeping on, some trail in Appalachia by myself at night. That's one of the scariest things I can imagine. I don't think I could do it. I don't think I want to do it. I wouldn't even want to try.
Have you ever had the isolated experience? I mean, you've talked about the yoga retreat, but that seems to be around other people eventually.
Well, yeah, that's sort of mental isolation, though, because it's deliberate. You averting eye contact and avoiding speaking. And that's something that I did twice, and the compound itself was isolated, but you're still surrounded by other people. So that was sort of an exercise in isolation, sort of mental, emotional, intellectual isolation. But
sure.
I haven't really been alone, far away from civilization before, by myself, ever. Maybe it would be valuable. I don't know. I tend to think, though, that the things that you do that you normally bounce off other people without really knowing it would start to fade away. Like what you wear, your clothes. I mean, did you just wear sweatpants all day?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I would just, that or cut holes in trash bags and put them on my legs.
Change my diaper every day, and that's about it.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, well, real quick. So the guy at the end of the episode, episode 3, I'm pretty sure that's
right?
Ledoux.
Ledoux, sorry. Why did I think of Lagrange? What is Lagrange? Lagrange. Oh, that's
a ZZ Top song, and it's also a place in Texas.
It's also, I think, a physics principle. Okay, anyway.
The big grunge?
No, the Lagrange radius or something. I don't know.
Okay.
Whatever.
Well, so I think that guy and the way he looks is supposed to be an allusion to H.P. Lovecraft's some of his characters that are described, the tentacled monsters that.
Well, it's one tentacle.
He's
supposed to be like Cthulhu, right?
Yeah, I think well, you've got the old gods, and I think Cthulhu is an old god, but then you've got these sort of tentacled monsters, or these sub. I don't know. Maybe
They're
he's a
the
reference to the.
spawn of Cthulhu, right? Isn't it
Yeah,
supposed to be that when Cthulhu comes back or awakens, then he has a bunch of spawn that come back too? So he'd be one of those, maybe. Yeah.
yeah, I can't remember, but like at the Mountains of Madness, what the thing at, and not Innsmouth, but I don't know. It's I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be an allusion to Lovecraft.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Cthulhu's diaper.
yeah. But I mean, it's kind of cool that if if he's using that source material and he wants to nod to it, then
Mm.
he does it in that way. It's like, oh man, how do you have a tentacled enemy in modern times?
Right.
A human tentacled enemy. Oh, this might be kind of cool.
Yeah.
So
And well, so there are some really great, besides elements thematically, there are some really great visuals in this episode. That's one of them, and the way that the narration is going, uh, Rust basically says at the end of, what does he say? At the end of something, there's a monster, and then
at the end of every dream.
at the end of every dream, there's a monster, and then that appears, and that is
Hmm.
just perfect, and they did that to great effect. The other great cinematic moment is the shot of Marty walking with the two girls after the sermon, and they're walking together, and they remain in perfect focus, but they're so far away from the camera, and it's so far zoomed in that it looks like they're not really making progress. Just cinematically, it's a really interesting shot. It's not something that you see very often because it's very intimate, but they're so far away from the camera. It looks like they're just sort of static on the landscape, walking with really shallow focus behind them. So it's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you pick those two things out. So
Yeah. So viewers, watch episode 3 if you haven't already, because we're about to get into a discussion of that. You challenged me in the previous discussion. You challenged me to point out the great line,
yeah,
and to see if it stuck out at me. And I have 2 candidates, I think.
yeah,
Yeah. So I'm just gonna say the 2 in the order that I think they go in,
uh-huh.
and then you can let me know. So one's right at the beginning, and I actually wrote it down. It said, if the only thing keeping a person decent is the expectation of divine reward, then that person is a piece of shit. That's a great line.
Uh-huh.
The other one is, the world needs bad men. We keep the other bad men from the door. 2
Yeah.
great lines. Is that not neither of those?
Neither of them.
Really?
Yeah,
Those are the 2 that I was watching for it too, and those are the 2 that stuck out at me. Those are great lines.
yeah. There's tons of great dialogue in this episode.
Indeed.
Tons.
So what is it then?
My favorite line, probably in the whole series, is when Maggie calls Rust, and he's towards the end of the episode, and she's asking about, well, where's Marty? And it's right after they went out on the double date, and she's asking why do men do this, something something something. He says, because we know what we want and we don't mind being alone. So I just sort of coming from him, sort of being an intense hermit like character who's even killed and brilliant. It's sort of the embodiment of what Saint Anthony, Saint Francis, and all these sort of sages that have come before. And I think it just seems to belie his sort of Buddhahood almost, in the sense
Let's
that
call him now. I've got a new name for him, because toward the end of this episode, it became very clear to me that he's Dark Alan Watts. That's who he is. Alan Watts even talks about life being a dream. It's all a dream.
yeah,
You
cool.
wake up and you've had a dream about being a person at the end of your life, but he does it from the opposite vantage, because Alan Watts, when you listen to Alan Watts talking, you usually feel optimistic and hopeful, but his view on things is a lot more dim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, maybe, I don't know, just, man, when I saw this series for the first time and that line rolled out of his mouth, we know what we want and we don't mind being alone. But what's the opposite of that? You don't know what you want and you can't be alone.
Right.
And, you know, looking at him and how, you know, let's say specifically how women play a part in his life as the, you know, the opposite of male. And then looking at Marty and looking at how women play a part in his life. You know, Marty doesn't know what he wants and he can't be alone. So
right.
He's sort of the opposite of Rust's statement. And then you look at Rust and, you know, women are in his life, but not in a sort of intimate companionship way. Mm-hmm. But he knows what he wants and he doesn't mind being alone. And I think so it's just kind of an interesting.
Why do you think that resonates with you? Does that sort of resonate with any personal experience or your anything in your background, or is that just something that intellectually interests you?
Yeah, I wasn't gonna put down my deck of cards, but it was more of, I think, you know, those personality types have always been kind of attractive. The ones that are just sort of self-sufficient and man, they don't really have huge ups and downs. They've just got this sort of even-keeled existence. And, you know, maybe when you grow up really religious and you're sold on this idea of there being that this world is not your home, it's just a dream, then even when you kind of come out of that, it's a hard mindset to shake. Mm-hmm. But you can see that same mindset as being critical and ultimate in the livelihoods of, you know, people we're still talking about today. You know, they have just like a singular focus, and that seems to sustain them. And yeah, I don't know, with a character like Rust, you know, he knows what he wants and he doesn't mind being alone. So just nothing, you know, it seems like he's the kind of character who's compelled by something bigger than himself. And it, you know, it seems like you can see, you know, the world is trying to throw things at you all the time to get you to act a specific way that somebody else wants you to act. And when you kind of like when you mentioned not being so concerned about important things, you know, well, those, you know, the world is trying to throw those, hey, this is important, do this and act this way. And then when you kind of see beyond that, then, or when you're given a glimpse beyond that, it seems like there's the opportunity for something more intrinsically motivating, mm-hmm. to sort of take hold and be compelling. And yeah. So at that point, you're not really at the whims and fancies of as many motives and forces outside of yourself.
Right. So, it's almost like everyone else is wearing. I'm sorry about all these malformed analogies. I apologize, but I can't really think any other way. I really apologize, but I'm about to talk about Velcro. So it's almost here goes. If not here, where? If not now, when? It's like if people are wearing a Velcro suit, right? And everything is made of the opposite of what you're wearing, right? In terms of in Velcro vernacular, and it sticks to you and it drags on you, but maybe someone like him is able to slide through because he's kind of figured out how to you know, already have either Velcro stuck to him or just kind of take the suit off and just kind of move through. And I think having something that drives you and gives you purpose in life on a deeper level really facilitates that. If you read about people like Isaac Newton, who was, I guess, kind of a bitter old dude, he had no interest in anything like that because he was obsessed with his alchemy, and he was obsessed with all of the scientific work that he was doing and studying prisms and the spectrum of light and all that stuff, because it was like a calling. And when you have a real calling, or at least a purpose-driven life, maybe it's that you just don't stick to as much stuff. Whereas if you don't have that, then it's almost like it feels like the things that stick to you are the purpose. Whereas actually not that those things aren't important, but maybe sometimes they're not, and they can sort of cause you to really fluctuate emotionally on the roller coaster of life. The ups and the downs are more extreme, perhaps. The cat hair flying around. Yeah. Yeah,
and like you're looking for where somebody like Rust has or any of these sages or any of these sort of Alan Watts kind of characters or people like that, they don't really look for, this is another thing that Russ brings up, satisfaction and fulfillment. Somebody like Watts probably didn't look for satisfaction and fulfillment in places that aren't meant to offer satisfaction and fulfillment, because it's not what those things are for.
To an extent, although, well, I don't know. Sometimes people are really very capable of articulating that kind of thing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they practice it. So I don't know everything about Alan Watts, but he drank a lot. And he did a lot.
He had 3 marriages.
Three marriages. And he did a lot of LSD, which is probably a good thing for him. You would expect, you'd have to, right? If you're Alan Watts, you kind of have to. So I don't know. I don't know if he was the detached sage that he seems in his talks. I don't know, and I think maybe not as much as it looks like, but he was good at just sitting down and going off on a topic for an hour and a half without missing a beat and without hitting it just perfectly. A lot of the things he says are kind of silly, and he gets maybe scientific points wrong, but there's really nothing more enjoyable than listening to Alan Watts talk. He's just such an articulate speaker and able to pull together all of the pieces of religious thought that most people aren't able to pull together because they exist in one specific camp. But he's a wanderer of that sort of landscape, and not everybody has read all of the Christian text that he's read and knows as much about the Christian tradition as he knows, and at the same time has also read things like the he's read the Tao Te Ching, he's read Confucius, he's read basically all of the Vedas, and so he's steeped in it, and he's just swimming around when he's just playing with it because he knows it so well. But that, I don't know that translates into action for him specifically.
Yeah, and as an example, as his name came out of my mouth as exemplifying or embodying this ideal I'm talking about, it's like, maybe not him. I might want to take it back because of the alcoholism, and maybe I don't know what the marriages were like. Maybe they ended all amicably, but I don't know. There seem to be markers.
They don't just suddenly end.
Chaos.
Usually exactly. Yeah, you don't just say, you know what? I think mutually we can just let's both move on. It doesn't usually go like that. Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe there's a better example, but I
get the idea.
That's the line. Like, did that line sort of jump out to you at all when you heard it?
Not really, no. No. I mean, not any more than when he said, go to bed, Maggie. I mean, it was just sort of, it didn't, I don't know why, it didn't pop out at me.
Yeah.
And I was trying to look for stuff, and maybe it's just, I don't know. I don't know why it didn't. I can't explain it.
So
sorry. I'm sorry. I feel sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I think at that time when I saw it, I was surrounded by a lot of people attempting relationships, and it seemed to me like I was not in a relationship. It just wasn't a concern of mine.
You've got the hat. What else do you need?
Because And so it just seemed like there were a lot of people going about a relationship seeking the wrong thing, or seeking for a relationship to fulfill them, when that's not really what they were thinking. They were going to find what they were looking for in a relationship, and it just seemed like it never really worked out or panned out for them. And that being one of the things that human beings just we get bombarded with the idea of sort of that specific type of relationship, which sort of goes back to the episode 2 discussion about, oh, we have a relationship and then eventually you produce another worker, right? And that being such a common, what, red herring, would that be the correct term? That,
Yeah, sure.
hey, you can find it here, but it, in so many ways, and at that time when I first saw this series, that's not the place where people's energies could have been best used to find sort of satisfaction. So,
or at least maybe to each their own, meaning that some people might genuinely find it there, but for those who shouldn't, because maybe they're not capable of finding it there, they believe they can find it there because they've bought into the red herring, and so that confuses them and maybe keeps them from pursuing what they should actually pursue, which might ultimately lead to satisfaction or a purpose-filled life. So that it makes sense. I get it. I think your analysis of it is spot on, Sally. Really good. Great work.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. No, but can I talk about the line that stuck out to me?
Yeah. Please.
Yeah, great. All right. So the one that really stuck out is right at the beginning. If the only thing keeping a person decent is the expectation of divine reward, then that person is a piece of shit. That is a great line.
Yeah.
And that is I am frustrated by how few people realize how true that is. It's frustrating to me that we've had the religious discussion, but it's frustrating to me that so few people understand that they are good because it's built into them to be good. And if we were genetically programmed to think that murder was wonderful, then none of us would be here. It can't exist in our code, and if it did, it would be immediate species extinction. And most of our morality is like that. Mm-hmm. And yet, when you talk to especially a Christian, they ascribe their morality to the Bible. But then if you ask where specifically, what are you talking about? 10 Commandments? Is that what you're talking about? The things covered in the Bible don't cover the range of choices that are available in everyday life and the things that you come across in everyday life. There's an underlying code that gives us the sort of ability to weigh what's right and what works, and obviously there's then a layer on top of that, which is the norms of society. But that's sort of a thing that is tied directly, I think, to the underlying sort of substrate of our programming. And if you look across cultures, it's really clear that in most cases, of course there are a lot of exceptions, but in most cases, the things that we believe are right and wrong, the things that we believe are good and bad or ethical, unethical, are kind of the same, even if you're in a pretty godless society like Sweden or China. Mostly completely agnostic or atheistic societies with crime rates far lower than the United States, and yet we're the Christian nation. And so what's going on there? What's up with that? Well, we have a lot of repression and guilt, and maybe our guilt because we believe we're doing things that have to be hidden causes us to do maybe even more than those places. So his point is that good people do what they do because that's just sort of how we're put together, or how our societies function, and Christians are doing those doing bad things anyway, but just secretly, and maybe that sort of needing to do it secretly causes guilt to make it even worse. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the conversation between him and Marty at the beginning of the episode was really interesting, because then Marty sort of views him as being, I think he says, afraid or panicked, which is clearly not the case.
Yeah.
And it's Marty who's again throwing up walls and not seeing it, even though it's couldn't be laid out more clearly.
Yeah. No, I love that line too, for the reasons that you just said as well. I think there is a level of panic. This and just
what do you mean?
Who's got panic? That Marty's accusation towards Rust is, I mean, I see the truth and the untruth of he seems panicked. It's like, yeah, in some sense he does have Rust.
In what sense? I don't see.
In the sense that his panic results in introversion and devotion to trying to unravel a thing. And it's not so much it's maybe trying to apply panic in that way. That's an interesting way to think about panic. But then how we would normally interpret panic, that, I'm freaking out, what am I going to do? I don't know how to deal with all this stuff. Yeah, he's not panicked that way. Not at all. Kind of how we would maybe imagine Marty would be panicked if he was in an overwhelming situation. So just kind of looking at, is there any truth to him being panicked? Okay, maybe there's a little bit of truth if we interpret panic in this way, but what about the way we would assume Marty would throw around the word panic? No, he's not panicked like that at all. He's even-keeled and measured, consistent. And, Marty's just projecting his own panic. But anyway.
So how would you then interpret it? If there's a panic in Rust, that would be what? In his overdone need to analyze everything? In his frustration with... Because it looks to me like, sort of like I expressed a little frustration about how few people see what the reality is, right? And that that doesn't make me feel panicked. It makes me just feel like, how is this not obvious to everybody? It seems so obvious. So it's more of a feeling of frustration that something that should be pretty clear is not clear, and that I live in a place where 85% of people think the opposite, and they also vote and they have jury duty as well.
Yeah.
It frightens me.
Yeah. Yeah. So a couple of things.
Not that Christians can't be intelligent voters. I'm just saying, that's an obvious misperception.
Yeah. So, I mean, I am waiting for the opportunity. I've had several discussions with family members and friends that are still Christians. And, it's an interesting question to bring up. It's, well, is the only thing that's keeping you good, this, hanging threat of punishment if you don't do good. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting discussion to have, because it does cause pause for reflection. And it's like, wow. And then you point out, well, look at all these other people that don't have any connection, like in China or Sweden, that don't really have any connection to religion. And they still, love their kids. They love their spouses. They love their friends and their family. And basically everything is the same.
Yeah. So do bears and vervet monkeys.
If you say so.
Well, I mean, that's another thing you can point to.
The two types of pets you have, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm sitting on a bear right now. A sleeping bear is my chair. I've got a bear chair.
The other
Go
thing.
Ahead. Yeah, say what you want to say. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I was going to bring up is that Freud, in his book Civilization and Its Discontents, we touched on this before in a different talk. He talks about sort of using these social norms and getting a people group to believe that this is good and this is bad. And then what that does is all the sort of, when you tell somebody that something is bad, it's not really bad, then all this energy they would devote to acting in a bad way, if they can't do that in that society, they have to express that energy in some way. So what they do is they sublimate it into whatever things are deemed as good, and they express it that way. And so
with great fervor.
Yeah, and so then you get the things like the results of the Puritan work ethic, where we build all these big cities and all these marvelous contraptions, but in some sense it's still not fulfilling the deep-seated need that we actually are looking to fulfill. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you could tie that into Russ' idea of isolation. He knows what he wants and he doesn't mind being alone, so he can sort of find fulfillment.
But you have to turn up the knob somewhere.
Yeah. And when society won't let you turn it up in this way, well, then you find your release in the other way that's deemed socially acceptable. I mean, and there's a lot of people poo-poo Freud, but I don't know, that seems a reasonable observation to make.
What would be a specific example of that, though?
Oh, man. Oh, God, I don't know. Well, so what if, man,
I'm gonna edit in Jeopardy music here.
Yeah. If I'm going to make that observation, I should be able to back it up with an example, right?
Right. Or an analogy. Even if it's Velcro related.
Man, I'm on the spot and I can't do it. I've worked it out in my head, but.
Well, okay. Well, let me say a thing, and then maybe you can, if you think of one in the meantime, because the thing I want to say is related. So, if we have like volume knobs, and it's like, actually, you know what? Here's a better example. Here's an analogy. You've played video games, right? You've probably played an RPG before. When you level up a character in an RPG, you get points that you can put towards different stats: wisdom, strength, constitution, armor, all that stuff.
Skyrim, Fallout.
Exactly. Skyrim would be a great example because there's a huge tree in Skyrim that you can assign things to, so you can really customize. But you have to use that. You got to use it. Mm-hmm. Right? And so it's almost like the requirement on you in society, or maybe even at the reality level, is that this energy needs to go somewhere. In the analogy of the video game, those would be the points, the experience points that you get. And so if it's frowned upon to put it here, basically is what you're saying. If it's frowned upon to put it here, then you've got to put it over here. Having maybe armor or whatever is not good for this group of people, so you've got to put it in wisdom or something like that. But you have to use it. But then that's sort of tied into the sort of fervor of the crowd in the audience. And he says about the preacher, I can't remember the way that he says it, but basically he is channeling their delusion, their collective delusion. They are all sublimating the thing that they're not allowed to level up. They're sublimating the thing that they're not allowed to level up, and then force projecting that onto him. And because of the strength of their sort of force projection onto him, he's sort of receiving it, like he has like a little satellite dish on his forehead, and he's got to then increase the intensity of his presentation as a way to sort of validate and almost tell them that they've successfully transmitted their sublimated whatever bad thoughts or whatever they might be. He's now sort of saying, okay, it's done now. The process is complete. The transaction is over now. You've seen how intensely I've projected this message, which is just some random kind of message that he's giving. Is not doesn't seem like that crucial, but they're all into it, and they're
Yeah.
reaction to him is sort of like a transaction. If you were sort of calm and just talking like this, then it wouldn't respect the social contract that we signed with you, which is that we've transmitted all of this junk to you. So you need to increase that. And our nodding is a recognition that you have done that correctly. And that's sort of, then that's the handshake that happens. And once that handshake is done, then everybody can leave, and then we'll come back next Sunday and do it again. So it's it's very interesting. It's very interesting. And it ties in very well to what we're talking about right now, which is the idea of this is not okay, sublimate, project. It's I think the reason that you could say religion has merits in some cases, because it can, I think, prevent some negative behaviors in society. I think it can. I don't think it's incapable of it, but I don't think it's at the level that most people ascribe it to.
Yeah. And
or ascribe to it.
One of the things that he says about the preacher is that there's also this dynamic of Ben compelling the audience towards virtue, right? So, hey, you can't act in this way, and you feel all guilty, and you got all this conflict because you have this desire, but you're told it's wrong. You've got all this energy. So then here's a place you can put that energy, put it into virtue, put it into these things that we deem virtuous. And I think that's where sort of that Freudian dynamic sort of lays over fairly well. And as far as the content of his message, if you listen to some of the words he's saying, it's very mystical stuff. It's the idea that he says, you wear a mask. I mean, that's a Jungian idea. And then what some of the other people that you mentioned, like
who else did I mention?
I can't remember who else he mentioned.
Yeah, but it's all the same idea. He's basically saying we've been severed from the reality, the celestial reality, the body of Christ, and we don't see it, so we have to reconnect.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, and just comparing it to, I don't know, maybe you can do this too. Sort of the sermons and all the stuff that I heard growing up. It sounds much more on the mystical side, because he really doesn't say God or Jesus or these specific names of Christian personages that would tie it directly to, Christianity. I mean, it sounds more, you can listen to what he says, and it sounds like a talk on Jungian psychology or on Buddhism or on Eastern ideas of, there is no such thing as, Vedic or Hindu ideas. There's no such thing as identity. It's just a mask that you wear, and you shed it off. You're like a monad. You shed off a personality, or the spirit inside of you sheds off a personality, then it jumps into another one, and then it does that over and over again. The language appeals a lot more to those ideas than specifically Western fundamentalist Christianity. So
yeah, when you were growing up, then what was the content? What were the sermons more along the lines of?
Just guilt, shame, punishment.
Was it with the same intensity, or was it a more low key?
It was much more low key. I mean, when you're there, the church that I grew up in, when you're there, I mean, there's a lot of really nice people there that love each other and look after each other. I mean, there's definitely that going on. There's also the idea of shame and guilt, which maybe I got that.
How overt is that, though?
The preacher I had when I was growing up, he wasn't preaching fire and brimstone all the time. He was a little bit more on the lines of, yeah, there's punishment, there's eternal punishment to be had. And he said things like Jesus talked about hell more than he talked about heaven. But there was a lot more about just the power of God to be effective in people's lives, to actually,
Were there any specific did you get any specific directives about what to do or not do, in your daily lives? Things like sexual guidelines or
Oh yeah, yeah,
ways to
yeah.
treat people? Yeah. What is that? What is that in the form of?
Yeah, it was more like the, sex outside of marriage kind of idea. Oh, this is these two people, then they wanted to shack up together and they weren't married, and that sort of that
Yeah.
wagging of the finger and
They got gonorrhea.
but then you have the altar call, and you've got sort of the come to Jesus
Hmm.
opportunity. But then I think it was more intense for me, like that presence of right and wrong in the Bible, but then mixed with the home life of sort of rigidity, discipline, and punishment. Not that I was abused or had that type of experience that a lot of people have had, but when you're a kid, or when you haven't, or when you're a kid, or when you even as an adult, when you don't have exposure to a lot of different ideas or alternative ways of thinking, and you get sort of what you typically get in a fundamentalist church in the South, and there's a lot of guilt and punishment, and so uh, which does that answer your
Yeah,
question?
yeah,
Okay.
I do have a follow up though, and if it's too personal, just say tango, tango, um, or whatever you want to say. So when you were growing up, my general sense is that you were pretty into it. That
Yeah.
you were in groups, and you in college you were actively you're quite active in the community, and you were one of the more outspoken, maybe, or mm,
I feel
enthusiastic,
like
genuinely enthusiastic about it.
I think I really believed it.
Yeah,
That's sort of I
but
believed. Yep.
okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So just to finish my question, and then I do want to hear what you have to say about it. Was that in any way related to what we've just been talking about the sort of volume knobs needing to be turned up because something else is there that can't be recognized?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah. So, uh,
please talk about that.
yeah.
If
So
it's not too
maybe,
personal.
yeah. No, no, no. I think maybe a lot of
Oops.
so here, this was really strange growing up. Um, that like playing video games, reading comic books that had sex or violence or things like that in it. Horror movies, like, oh, this is bad, you shouldn't be doing this. But then when I would draw pictures of, and so I was like, oh, I gotta, this stuff, this it's dark, it's attractive, it's cool, whatever.
Yeah.
And so, I
So you've always
couldn't,
been drawn to the macabre side of things.
yeah, for whatever reason, I don't know. But so, for example, the way that my release valve, I guess, was art, right? Making pictures, but when I would make pictures of superheroes or violent scenes, action scenes, whatever, it's like, oh, that's not good. But then
Who said
I
that's not
found
good? People who saw it, or you yourself to yourself?
me myself to myself, but then also I had at least one relative who brought up that kind of stuff with me, and then uh, but then when I made the violent pictures in the context of religion, like, oh, I'm going to draw a picture from Revelation, the book of Revelation,
A lot of
or
fodder there.
oh man, thank
Yeah.
God. And so, for me,
Was that
it's,
intentional? All right. Yeah.
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 So where I would draw a bloody Jesus hanging on a cross, and that was fine. But
Yeah.
these really violent, macabre scenes that were
Yeah.
religious, it's like that's okay. So
Interesting.
that, yeah, that is sort of
They're just
maybe a good,
they're just Canaanites.
yeah, yeah. God didn't like. I mean, they're just Hittites, Canaanites. So
Yeah.
Plan B people that God created. So, um, yeah, I don't. Yeah, that might be a pretty good example of sort of that sublimation, and then, yeah,
So you were able to reroute that into a religious context that was then not frowned upon.
something that was more, at least my society, socially acceptable.
Well, but did that then create a sort of conflict within you, that you knew that you were doing the same kind of art and drawing blood is the same, but because of the context of the art, it was either acceptable or not. Did that bother you at all? Because that would seem to create a sort of, it's the same thing. It's just in a different context.
Violence.
It's still violence. Did that make you think, well, what? It's kind of hypocritical a little bit?
Yeah, not till later. I don't, a lot of those, not until I sort of got out of that bubble and it got exposed to more ideas just from people that were from other countries or other worldviews, then sort of wait, this is hypocrisy. It's, exactly what you're saying, probably what most people figure out 10 to 15 years earlier because they don't stick around in church. They're not sort of threatened with punishment for not sticking around.
Right.
So
yeah, makes sense. It's interesting to hear about your history a little bit, because mine, even though it's still Christian, is quite different, and it was much less orthodox, much more free form, sort of on the fringe, and so I didn't have any of that. I didn't have any of that really heavy feeling of guilt or specific directives for how to behave. A few things here and there, but not very serious. And and in fact, now that my parents are separate, my mom has become more devout in that sense because she hadn't been before, and my brother too. So they've become a lot more traditional, and that's been interesting to see how that plays out. My little brother is now he's a preacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that a surprise to you, or?
No, it's not a surprise at all. No, it's interesting to see. It's interesting to see the transformation that happens when people change their identity and really take something on seriously. And it's also interesting to have in the back of my mind the knobs. And those particular volume sliders and what might be going up or down. It's very interesting to watch. I would never try to talk somebody out of anything or even try or even say that they shouldn't or whatever. It's good. Happy for them. Yeah. But I like to debate though. Yeah. I like confrontation. That sort of confrontation is interesting. But then but just for fun,
Yeah, sure.
I don't really care. Okay, so I want to actually. Do you have anything else to say about that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about a theme. Would you say that there is a theme in this particular episode that links together the man with the crab traps, Marty, and the believers in the tent? I really saw this sort of underlying current of blinders being an important component of not going crazy.
Yeah.
And that the man with the crab traps, and Marty even said it later, I guess everyone has their thing or something like that. The guy has crab traps, right? And he just focuses on that thing, and he sort of was critical of him, but he then said everybody has their thing, and he's got his crab traps. I can't remember the line, but I think the takeaway was, if you focus on something and that's your thing, and you don't look up from that work, you've willingly placed blinders on yourself as a way to evade the existential crisis of oncoming death, basically, and aging. And then right. So and then Marty says the same thing, and I think he's using it as a way to sort of disguise his guilt for cheating on his wife, but he brings up this sort of cartoon example where he's feeling like he's running off a cliff because he's approaching 40, and he sees old age coming on, and he feels,
I can see 40 coming up, and I just feel like Wile E. Coyote, and I'm running off that cliff, but if I just keep looking up and don't look down, then I'll be okay.
Right. So that's the same kind of theme, and I think It's interesting that he said that about the man with the crab traps, and you would think that you would actually think that Rust would say that about the man with the crab traps, because he's usually more above the landscape looking down. And so it's interesting that actually it was Marty who said that, because he's then the one who was talking about himself approaching 40 and needing to have blinders from below so that he didn't see the end of the cliff as he was running off. And I don't know how much of that was him just hiding, because initially his throat started to shake because he thought his wife was on to him, basically, right? And knew that he was cheating on her. And then then I think he just quickly transitioned to something else. And I think that's what he shifted to as a way to, then she got on his team after that. Yeah. She thought that's what it was, but I don't think that's what it was initially. Then you have the people under the tent at the beginning who are all basically tunnel vision focused on the preacher, and that is the thing that gives meaning to their lives, that keeps them from seeing that the cliff has long disappeared from under their feet. And so I sort of felt that as a theme that ran through it, and I wonder if you saw the same thing or picked that out at all, or if that's not right.
No, I didn't really pick up on that theme. I did notice, I mean, I remember the conference, there was something that I think the preacher said, not the preacher, but sorry, something that, I thought I wrote it down so that it happened in that conversation you're talking about, but no, I didn't really pick up on that dynamic.
What do you think about Marty saying that? Do you think that his behavior, is it all based on his fear of getting older, or is he just saying that as an excuse or as a way to sort of cover his guilt?
Yeah, it's, an aversion to dealing with your fear, and then by contrast, looking at Rust, and he's sort of dealt with the fear. He's like we said before, he's been to that abyss and he's kind of come back out of it. And so he can sort of deal with it.
So if Marty is facing an abyss, then what is Marty's particular abyss?
Maybe it's the fear of death and aging. That seems to be the most obvious. Maybe it's not, but, you can, in the show, you can see the cracks in his armor every time it comes to his domination of women being threatened. Mm-hmm. For instance, when Rust comes over to return the lawnmower and he mows the grass, and then he goes inside and he's hanging out, he's talking to Maggie, and then Marty comes home and he sort of flips out because this other male is infringing upon my territory, this thing that I dominate. This is for me. Yeah. And so when when his prowess or his virility or his domination, his kingdom is threatened, specifically in relation to women. Yeah.
Well, there's some serious sexual tension between
Maggie and Rust.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious.
Well, yeah. Well, and yeah, for sure. I mean, looking at Marty's dynamic there, he feels very threatened and he feels scared. And then Rust feels very comfortable, very even keeled. Mm-hmm. He doesn't, when he's over at the house talking to Maggie, he's found an equal, he's found a partner, right, to get, he gives advice and he gets advice and they share, he's found an equal.
Exactly. That's where the tension comes in. Like, you feel that there's some sort of click there immediately. Even when he first comes to dinner, there's something where they just, without any need for introductions, they somehow get each other. It's almost like they're soulmates or something. It's weird.
Yeah. Soulmates in contrast to the mate, right?
Right. Yeah. Soulmates in the purely, sort of synergy fitting together sense. They're a good pair for conversation, if not more. But there is some more tension there, I think.
Well, yeah, and I think that observation sheds light on Rust's statement that we know what we want. We know what we want, and we don't mind being alone. It's like, he wants Maggie, but he knows that would sort of violate maybe his own ethics, but also violate these other things that he wants to leave intact.
Right. Right.
His friendship and all these other things. And he says, therefore, and I don't mind being alone, so this thing isn't going to
Right.
mess
So he's
up
willing,
my life.
which is interesting because it shows that he's mature enough to see his. It's sort of like, it's sort of like how we were talking about in the last one. He's sort of this sort of zeppelin floating above the landscape in a way, and he's able to look down on his emotions and his urges and name them as though they're artifacts in a museum and say, that is lust. And I have it, and here's a person who I have it for. However, if I look at the whole landscape, it can't exist alongside the other things that I have that are important to me. And I see that if I went with that one, it would corrupt the others, and they would either corrode or be destroyed. And so he just calling balls and strikes basically, and then is able to just move forward on that. And that's really interesting. That's what makes him not a stoic, but some sort of it allows him to just be part of the interesting things in life and pursue his passion, and not completely detach in the sense that someone might, become depressive or commit suicide. So he exists in the world and is part of an investigation that's, could save women in the future. He's doing something important, and at the same time, he's detached from the things that normally get people wrapped up, and that's very beautifully contrasted with Marty's complete opposite. Basically, he's a breakfast burrito of emotions. He can't do anything else other than get wrapped up in his emotions. He should not go over to his mistress's house and beat up her boyfriend. It's a stupid thing to do. And and it's making a comment on how stupid we are for just immediately going with the very first thing that occurs to us. And Rust is the foil for that, to show us what we could be, maybe. Yeah.
Marty doesn't know what he wants, and he's afraid to be alone. Yeah. Rust knows what he wants, and he's not afraid of being alone.
Right.
So that's why that line is just so important to me, because it highlights their characters, and then we just sort of expounded upon the deeper implications of that. One has the overhead Zeppelin-like long view of everything. Well, I'm lusting here, but if I capitalize on that, if I act upon it, it's going to throw everything else that I really enjoy into chaos. And I'm not going to, in the end, that's not really what I'm after. There's a bigger thing that he's compelled by. Whereas Marty has the more earthbound view, a short distance sort of view that he doesn't really quite have a handle on, he doesn't understand. And so he acts upon it as, anybody in that same situation with the same cocktail of, past and experience, they probably do the exact same thing. So, it's a cool part of the show. It's a great part of this episode. It's a highlight to me. So
yeah, it sets up a great. It sort of furthers the dichotomy. Of the two types.
And one thing I wanted to bring out is, when Maggie and Rust are having those conversations together, they really are an embodiment of the mythological idea of these, almost of the hermaphrodite god. You've got, put into the idea of male and female, or feminine and masculine, but they dance together, they work together, they're a complement, they're a pair of opposites that revolves and dances together to make, project and think progress. She's giving him good advice, and he's given her, the opposite view, or the other view that would actually maybe inform her a little bit. So they're complements and a working pair.
Right.
And that's, that dynamic shows up in myths and stories. Isis, Osiris, Nut and Geb, the Sky Father, the Earth Mother, and,
is there anything in terms of anthropological or symbology that that maybe I didn't pick up on, that you, having seen it a few times, saw in this episode that could be sort of extracted? Because other than an exploration of the spiral a little bit more, it didn't seem like there was a terrific amount going on.
Yeah, I don't think nothing hit me on the head in this episode either. I think this episode is polishing a different facet of the True Detective crystal for us to look through.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Yes. Being that dichotomy that you just talked about, and also the relationship, and also I think a comment on humanity as a whole, morality, and marriage as well.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting part where later Marty is talking about marriage and structure and having boundaries, and at the very same time it's showing him doing the complete opposite thing. And so what is that saying? What is the comment there?
I can think about where I'm from and all the people I grew up around. It has sort of, not everybody, definitely not everybody, but maybe close relations that have sort of, that narrative that again, another theme of the show is the narratives we're given by society of how we should act, how we have to act, where we will find fulfillment, and how we will find fulfillment. But then when we venture into those prescribed narratives, we find they're not fulfilling, yet we will repeat the thou shalt and thou shouldn't given by those narratives, and project guilt that you should feel guilty for acting this way or not acting this way. And so, think, for example, Marty being a philanderer, is that an appropriate?
Sure.
I think without being able to recite the definition, I think philanderer is appropriate. He's cheating on his wife, but yet he'll sort of shout out that line of, but you shouldn't cheat on your wife, kind of, you shouldn't treat women this way, kind of like how he deals with the prostitute that's less than 18 years old. And she's too young, she doesn't know any better. I the man know how women should act.
Good old cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, just thinking about growing up, it's like, oh yeah, I know several people that they know the prescription, the moral, but they don't really act according to that moral, right?
Yeah. They haven't really imbued it. They haven't.
Go ahead.
They haven't really processed what it means.
Because
if you really process something and understand something, I think there are levels of knowing something. So obviously we're capable of great extremes of cognitive dissonance. We can believe two completely contrary things at the same time, because the parts of our brains that cause us to act are maybe more reptilian, and the front of our brains is kind of separate from that, and it can come up with all kinds of wonderful and interesting ideas that don't have to be directly tied to that sort of primal reptilian, maybe very sometimes sexual, sometimes strongly emotionally motivated side, right? So it's perfectly acceptable to, because you grew up in a certain environment, believe that I think I gave the example before of that scientist who believes that the Earth is 6,000 years old and at the same time practices geology, which is the science of understanding how many billions of years old the Earth is exactly. So he's able to do both, because on an intellectual level he has one understanding, and on a maybe nostalgic emotional level he has another, and he's able to keep those side by side. So, but even more so on the level of action, we're able to say what we believe and talk about what we believe, and that when we're actually doing the opposite, it's not, we don't have the direct connection or the filter that says, hey, you're doing the thing that you just said is wrong. We might process it on some level, but I don't think there's much going on there. I think that those two things, it's almost like you can sort of just close that door for an hour and a half while you do the terrible thing and then open it again when you're done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Nap time, cerebral cortex, or frontal cortex. Yeah. Take it easy for a few.
And like reading all these different, traditions and holy books and stuff, you come to a lot of the good ones. It seems the ones that really stand the test of time and sort of find connections with others are the ones that say, yeah, but that's sort of what we do. We holding those, the ones that are cognizant enough to recognize the hypocrisy and being like, yeah, but hypocrisy is the norm in a sense. Whereas one can't admit the hypocrisy because of fear and desire, it seems. Anyway.
Well, it's that it's the drivers of the thing that causes us to do the hypocritical thing are much stronger than the intellectual, the knowledge that maybe it's wrong. And so it's sort of like, you do something. Your decisions are made at a deeper level than what you're aware of, right? And that's pretty much a fact. That there isn't any free will, right? And all of our decisions are made at a deeper level, then they bubble up to the surface, and it seems to us that we've made a decision. And so maybe it's just that maybe because that wiring is so deep in the mind that the emotional drivers are so powerful that it's almost a joke to say that willpower is enough to overcome those, unless there's a lot of maybe enforcing in the society that you live in or the culture around you. Then it's maybe impossible to overcome a lot of those things.
Yeah. Do you think then that it seems, thinking in that way, that we have these urges that are basically trying to get out, and they'll take the least possible path of resistance in order to get out, because they're coming out. It's going to happen. Yeah. And sometimes what Freud would call the superego, sort of the civilized father voice, sort of God voice that says, don't do this, that we get. The superego is sort of what we get handed down from our parents and from society and the outside world that says, you shouldn't do this. But then we've got the inside thing that's got to get out, and it has to navigate that superego to find the path out towards expression. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that, it seems like the idea of culpability for our actions, like we're dealing with it in the wrong way. We're dealing with the idea of crime and punishment in a way now that doesn't really accord with how we know the human body works. Absolutely. Like knowing that, let's say a child is born into situation A, B, and C. And then almost, like the parable that says, walk a mile in somebody else's shoes in their shoe.
It's a huge shoe.
Yeah.
God, the shoe's going on forever.
And
glad it's not my shoe. Glad it's someone else's.
with the point of, saying like, hey, think about things from somebody else's perspective. Think about where they're from, their past, everything that went into making them who they are. And then it almost seems inevitable that in every single case you would come across as even somebody who commits the most heinous thing. Yes, of course they committed the most heinous thing, because looking at them as a biological, physics-driven machine and thinking about the situation they're in, and it, bombarding them and then fashioning them into this algorithm that acts in a specific way. Well, then, yeah, of course, because that's predestination. That's physics, right? Yeah.
It's a very deterministic.
Very deterministic. I guess maybe materialistic too. And then, but in that case, it's, then you can say, well, of course they committed this awful act. There was no other thing that they were ever going to do differently. And in that sense, they're perfect. So even somebody who does the worst possible thing is, in a sense, perfect. Every bit of physics in them acted according to a law, right? And so maybe it's getting kind of thick and off track.
No,
but
let's go. Let's do it.
okay, okay. But
I'm right there with you.
But then we get upset and mad that they acted the way that they acted, right?
Yeah.
Which on one level, it's totally, I get it. Yeah, they committed this awful, heinous act. Yeah, I'm upset. I'm mad. It makes me. I don't want it to happen again. I don't want to see it happen again. But we hold them responsible as though they appeared on the planet at the point of that act, totally formed as that specific individual that totally autonomously decided to do this thing, knowing
Right.
full well and good that they shouldn't do it. But human beings, they don't appear on the scene as written in that instance. They're not ad-libbed into the narrative. They go back years and years and years, and they'll go forward years and years and years.
Well,
So
yeah. So I think that's a really good point to bring up. It's a very complicated thing to talk about because I think it has to be separated into two levels. You have to talk about things in terms of the absolute and the relative, right? In terms
sure.
of the absolute, basically we live in a 4-dimensional braid, right? Do you know what I mean by braid?
I mean, I would imagine sort of a DNA or like a
no. So
like this,
so there's a really interesting way of understanding time, and there's a really good book on this. Yuval Harari talked about it a little bit in actually Homo Deus, but
I haven't finished it.
Yeah, he talks about it a little bit in there, and then it's covered in more depth in another book. But I can't remember. Maybe Max Tegmark wrote a book called The Mathematical Reality or something about mathematical reality. Basically, the universe is this 4-dimensional braid. So if you imagine a single object sitting on a floor, right? That single object sitting on a floor is also passing through space, and maybe the Earth is orbiting. So let's say if you were to track that through space and you were to put a trail on it, then you would see this sort of 3-dimensional tube of table, right? Yeah. So if you were then to step back a level and you were able to look at the entire universe, a human being would not be, if it were an object, would not be this person walking around. It would be this sort of snake kind of thing. And
Donnie Darko.
Yeah, and inside the snake there would be these just extremely small, complex things coming in and out. So imagine food, right? You eat something, you would see one part of one snake coming into this snake, and then at some point dissipating, and you would see this incredibly complex things. Think about the atoms in our bodies, all of the atoms in our bodies, the blood vessels that we have moving around our bodies. So it'd be this unbelievably complex tube braid thing that eventually at the end of its life sort of went like this and became parts of other braids. So there's probably part of my braid was once in the body of a dinosaur, right? And you would see like this dinosaur end, and then all of these braids are ending at the same time, and then these things are going into plants and animals, and eventually part of this braid ends up in my braid that's now where I am. So if you're looking at the universe like that, you basically have to say, whatever happens is just, it's done. It's all done. Done is not even a thing. It's just this giant 4-dimensional object. And so part of that is then you have to say, well, what if then there's a way to take a pill that stops the person who's programmed to be a killer from killing? That's part of the 4-dimensional braid. That's part of the pre-programming of the universe. It's already done from the beginning because there is no beginning. Right. So if you start talking on that level, I think it starts to break down, because we live on this sort of subjective, relative human level, and we can't really, if we start to talk about it separately, and we start talking about the bigger picture and how everything is deterministic and is just sort of pre-programmed, which it is, then it's sort of like, well, what are we going to do about that? There's no action you can take, right? Because it's all just done. So, okay, the only thing you can really talk about is maybe developing drugs or genetic manipulation when someone's a baby to sort of rewrite those pathways or change some genes so that they don't become serial killers. So maybe that's good, but that's then still part of the braid that's already there. So if you have to talk about things on the relative level, it seems like jail time, incarceration, and maybe even capital punishment seems ridiculous because someone is not responsible for their actions. But on the level of human society, they are, even though they aren't. They are and they aren't, right? And so it becomes, the only thing it becomes is another one of the factors in an equation that objectively reduces it on a society level. So it might not stop it for someone who has so many factors in favor of murdering that doesn't change the balance. But it does for someone who is basically, if this were legal, I would totally do it. If I had to go to jail for 20 years, I totally wouldn't. For someone who's pre-programmed with that, then it's going to tip it toward the scale of not doing it. And so like that sort of punishment, although it's silly, it tips the scales on a society level and makes it reasonable to put people in jail, even though it's stupid and people aren't responsible for their actions.
Yeah. Do you think that having it does? Yeah, for sure. And because I think it makes sense because it starts to talk about as transparently as we can right now the actuality of how things work. It's not, we're not talking in terms of, oh, he's got a demon inside of him. We're talking about, chemically they're predisposed to act this way in this circumstance and also build up this narrative that would compel them to then murder somebody that they get angry with, Whereas when we have a conversation like this, how is, in a sense, it's almost like telling us we're compelled to feel empathy for somebody who's murdered, right? Or for somebody against whom a heinous act is committed. And then when we can speak more transparently about the events that led up to that act, well, then we can see into the future in a sense and say, okay, how do we create a different environment so that murder compelling environment no longer exists?
Right.
We create something else. And so
move a few of the elements in the equation over to the other side. Yeah,
absolutely. Even if it's merely, okay, you and I aren't going to create the drug, whatever, that precludes people from ever doing something like that. But the way that, because we're thinking this way, then maybe the way that we then go out into the world and interact from here on out is a little bit more conducive to creating that reality where those conditions are non-existent, or which, all this was, here's the cool thing. All of this conversation was in a sense instigated by this show about occult murder in the bayou. And so it's just stringing those events and those connections of art meeting reality, or mythology meeting reality, meeting science, meeting the future. It's just, man, what a weird.
It's very weird.
kind of cosmic, spooky, and wonderful thing, right?
And what's actually happening there? Because really what's happening is that you have a thought. So I do a thing. I decide that I'm going to start having conversations on YouTube. And then you have a thought that you have a thing that you like that you tell me about. And that could go either way. It could either go the way of, no, I'm not interested. No, let's not do that. Or, yeah, let's do that. And then that leads to each of the conversations that we have, which is in one way understanding what we've seen sort of causing certain neurons to fire that wouldn't have previously. But on another level, it's almost as though there's another braid happening in the space between us that's sort of slowly shifting the zeitgeist forward like giant tectonic plates. And, tectonic plates aren't pushed from the behind or pulled from the front. They're moved along by all of the sort of the undercurrent of magma beneath them, right? And so it's sort of like maybe the conversation that we're having, it's not important on any sort of grand level, but it's the sort of thing that because we're at this time in the evolution of our particular culture that we're able to talk about these things because shows exist, because someone wrote a book about because H.P. Lovecraft, because, and
Yeah.
now we're able to become a tiny little piece of the shifting zeitgeist, which then might lead to someone developing a way to adjust people's genes so that they don't commit crimes in the future. It's very interesting how that tapestry unfolds.
Yeah, and then think of, here's a question I like to ask people is think of all the things that we know people did 200 years ago that we just think now are just barbaric and awful and horrible. But back then they probably just thought it was normal. It's like, yeah, the Greeks had slaves and they probably didn't bat an eye about it. They just thought this is how the world. The Greeks didn't?
Even the most enlightened Greeks didn't bat an eye. Socrates was like, yeah, slaves, of course.
Yeah, but today we think it, we view it as a horrible, heinous thing that we couldn't imagine doing. All right. So what sort of normal things that you and I do right now, 200 years from now, are going to be thought about as monstrous and atrocious? Yet right now, our consciousness has not.
I think about this all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. This takes up a large part of my day.
So
I ask people this question, and most people I ask this question to just go, "What? I don't know. I'm going over there.
I'm going to go get my Euro and my Coke Zero. Leave me alone."
Yeah, yeah.
There's a great line in a Father John Misty song, "The Ballad of the Dying Man," and it's about this guy who is just calling out people for the rights and wrongs that they're doing, and thou shalt, thou shouldn't, and just up on his high horse, and he. And one of the lines in the song is that, or the point of the song is, it's on some level, it's futile to think that way, to get so caught up and been out of shape about morality in the context of eternity, because as Father John Missy says, we're all going to be wrong someday, kind of pointing out to the idea, at least effective to the point of what we just agreed upon, where what do we do now that 200 years from now we'll be wrong about? Kind of like the Greeks, what did they do I don't know, 1,000 years ago that they're wrong about, kind of, that we view as wrong? And so who's going to be thinking, and what are they going to be thinking that we're doing now that's wrong? So
but then that's a step forward, just acknowledging that we are not capable of imagining that reality, and there's nothing objectively wrong or right. You can't. Okay, so evolution doesn't have an endpoint. It's not working toward perfection. All it is adjusting to changing realities and making things more or less likely to survive. So looking back at ancient Greece, you can't say that slavery is objectively wrong. All you can say is that in our current culture, within this current zeitgeist of ethics, it is. That's all. You can't say anything else, and it sounds really weird to say that, but it's true.
Yeah.
There's no ultimate right or wrong, and so it's not that there's anything that's more right or wrong historically, right? Those future people will have much more evolved ethics than us, and they will view us as barbaric. But we can't step outside of our present sort of society braid thing. We can't step outside of it and see that. And if we were to claim future things as moral, they might be regarded as, in our reality, immoral.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's
but if you're like an inch ahead, then you're the one who moves it toward that. So it's an interesting thing where if you're right in the middle, then you're just a normal person. If you're behind, then you're sort of a bad person. If you're ahead, you're maybe an extreme person, but maybe moving things forward. And if you're way over here, then you're probably in jail or you know what I mean?
So kind of with your illustration, if you've got the person in the middle and they're morally right or good, useful, spot on, the person that's behind the times is an extreme, right? They're an extreme in this direction.
Well, or maybe just it depends how far behind, but
an inch behind. They're sort of an extreme. They are an extreme, and then also the person ahead of the time is an extreme in a sense. And so,
in a sense,
it's just, and not to. It's just an interesting idea to then say, wait a minute, that seems to resonate and make sense. What do I do with that now? Oh, this leads to detachment in some sense. And in a sense, detachment in a sense of play, kind of like Rust is able to do just easily, because he's like, look at how he acted when he went to the bunny ranch, right? Mm-hmm. He did not get off put by the situation that those women were in. He was able to, in a sense, know the situation, practice probably empathy in order to move forward towards his goal and not leave people behind him feeling damned or praised. It's just he knows how to dance. He knows how to wear a mask and move in a manner of play in the situations he's in.
Right.
Whereas Marty,
go ahead.
Just real quick, like whereas Marty gets caught into the whims of sort of timeliness, where Rust exists in timelessness. Marty exists in timeliness, where he's like, this is moral, this is right. And he rides on these waves of emotion, of ups and downs and extremes. Right. And so
he's tied to the roller coaster.
He's bound to the time he lives in.
Right.
He's got the earthbound view, not the Zeppelin view, the right now, and whereas Rust has the here, now, and never, and for eternity, and then the big overarching view. So anyway,
right, yeah,
to tie it back to the show.
Well, but you have those sorts of people throughout history, and it's almost like a repeating pattern. It's not necessarily people though, because I think sometimes it's hard to define what is the people part and what is the thing that just sort of organically arises. Like you could look at the empathy sphere, which is always expanding. When we were just a hunter-gatherer band and we met another, slaughter them, they're inhuman, we just kill them all. You have no sympathy for them because they're not in your tribe. Who cares? You kill them all, you eat them. Yeah, of course. Delicious people over there.
Yeah.
But then...
Well, my Hittite Euro.
And then that expands to, well, then you have a city-state sort of developing, and then you have an identity surrounding the city-state, and then those people become part of your larger sphere of empathy, even if that's outside of your tribe. You don't know who they are, but when you know that it's someone who has your same city-state identity, then that becomes something that offends you. If someone, like, that person is hurt, you don't know them, but you know that they share your identity, so it's reasonable to go to war with the people who made that offense. And then it expands to the nation level. Now you have nationalities. You have a sort of beyond patriotism and nationalism, and then it's still an us versus them, but it's all the same thing. And then it's now slowly becoming a global thing because we stopped having these sorts of the feeling that every interaction had to be a zero-sum game. And once we realized that. And I watched a TED Talk at one point about how this was sort of initiated by people doing business, starting to travel around the world and do business globally and realizing this, and it started to spread. So now we have this sort of worldwide empathy sphere that's now extending to animals. So it's continuing to expand. And if we're ever visited by aliens, then that's going to be sort of solidly human, animal, earthbound things versus... the xenomorphs or whatever they're called, whatever aliens are visiting us.
Do you think because at that point when we sort of have that interspecies empathy that we'll be cognizant enough to say, oh, let's look back at the mistakes we made, and as these new aliens come to meet us, maybe we shouldn't make the same mistakes we made then, and we'll just automatically think, we recognize that we were afraid of difference. So maybe we don't have to be as afraid of difference as new differences approach us. So we won't sort of, it's sort of, instead of a linear sort of evolution, it's more of a like this.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think we'd have to know the answer to one thing, though, is why is it that the empathy sphere expands? Does it expand? Does it expand because of the deeper level sort of reptilian brain processing something, or does it expand because we start to intellectually grasp a new idea? And if it's the first, then I don't think that we will have that sort of
It'll be Independence
predisposition
Day.
to, yeah, exactly. I really think that, yeah, I think it depends. I don't know. What do you
Yeah.
think?
So I like fractals. Fractals are super cool.
Yeah.
Fractals are spirals.
Fractals are dope.
Yeah, they're rad. Um,
Fractals are sick, man.
yeah. So if you think of, if we sort of roll back the clock and think about a human being and all the different constituent parts that came together to make up a human being, or even think right now, let's think about something like Apple, right? Apple is an entity. It sort of has a soul and a body in the sense that it's made up of the ideas and the lives of all these people that contribute to making it exist in the first place. Okay.
Yeah.
And in a sense, all those different people perform different tasks. They're almost like different types of cells.
Right.
All these cells over here work out the international business part. All these cells over here work out the technical side. All these cells over here work out the GUI, right? The graphic user interface. Okay. Are human beings not also a culmination of different constituent parts? Like all the red blood cells do this, perform this action over here. All the white blood cells perform this action over here. And before Apple came together, all these different people came together to make Apple, all those different people still existed. What are our constituent parts that before they all came together, gravitated towards one another to then interplay and interact to eventually form a human being? What were they doing before, right? It seems like there's that idea of, just gravity, things coming together to then work together and form something bigger than themselves.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So you think about all these different bacteria or whatever in a pool, they got attracted to one another because of gravity and then started to interact. And over time, it became a human being, right? Sort of evolved.
Not quite, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I couldn't defend sort of.
Let's say this. Okay, there's a good analogy here, though. There was a cell that replicated in a certain way, an early cell that at some point developed it's a theory, developed a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria. And the bacteria and the cell, they think, lived side by side very closely. And sort of like you would see any sort of symbiotic relationship like bees and flowers or something. But eventually, they became so interdependent that they became a single thing, and that is now the modern cell. And the bacteria, the original bacteria, is what they think is the mitochondria in the cell. They think the mitochondria of every cell used to be a separate free-living bacteria that was sort of absorbed because of the depth of the symbiotic relationship. So we have that sort of thing. But I don't know. That's an interesting thought to say that on a planet level, what that would be. Because each thing is a separate thing. You have a nation over here and a nation over here and a nation over here. So what would be the different functions that happen across the planet?
Yeah, for now, it's a nation over here, and over here. Who knows what that's going to look like in 50 years even. We'll see it probably in our lifetimes, what sort of a human species-wide, global species evolves into. I think it seems like corporations and huge international entities are kind of like the symbiotic parts coming together to then form something bigger than itself. You've got people coming together to form an entity bigger than each human part.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's just naturally occurring. You even said all this started with business people traveling around each other and this interaction, this interplay. And even think of cities as throw in the idea of gravity. That cities draw people from all over the planet to come live in that city. It's got its own sort of gravity, this attraction and this weight that just pulls people towards it. You're in New York, I'm in Madrid, we were in Seattle. We've been going to these big cities because of some type of attractive quality, right? So what about when you've got, say, all these different not mitochondria, but bacteria that have come together, and then all these other bacteria are also coming together, and then it all kind of mishmashes around and becomes something bigger than just the individual bacteria, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned, yeah. So why did you mention fractals then?
Oh, because if you look at it, so look at a corporation, that's a big entity, right? It's a big sort of obvious thing. But then if you sort of back it down, there's the same pattern going on at a human level. And if you back it down, there's the same pattern going on at a bacteria level. Right.
Okay, that's why I thought you mentioned it. I just wanted to make sure that's why you mentioned it. So you have an evolution is sort of a process that applies to more things than just individual organisms. Evolution is a process that applies to design. It's a process because you would design maybe 30 things and then put them in the wind tunnel, and then whichever one made it out is the one that is you go with, right? When you're designing a physical object. And living or dying is the wind tunnel of organisms. But when we reach that planet level, then our planet is like an organism that then is swimming in a sea of maybe other planets with other sentient beings, and we have to see are we the big fish in the sea, or how far along are we compared to other planets and if there are intelligent beings living on other planets, are we the pond scum of the cosmos, or are we the top tuna? What are we? Then there's another level of evolution, and going back to fractals, it's sort of like it's the same pattern over and over again. But why is it like that? It doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that there's this repeating pattern of evolution and organisms that come together that have a sort of a combined function that unite and become a single thing. It's very mind-boggling.
Isn't that what happened with the planet in the first place, when you have gravity coming together and then a rock gets another rock, it starts spinning together, and the other rocks kind of join it? I mean, it seems like that is the narrative, and it's the narrative. And human beings are always looking for patterns or a narrative. And so, and narratives are compelling, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so, and in this show, we have a narrative, and it's compelling. And so, it seems like the compelling nature of the show, the compelling nature of this sort of narrative of a life and death cycle of a species or humanity, and looking at fractals, oh, here we've got this narrative on a corporation level. We've got a narrative in a TV show. We've got a narrative in psychology. We've got a narrative in biology. And that's just, it seems like a useful tool to help illuminate and maybe wield effectively sort of our existence. Oh, there's a narrative. Where can I find?
Well, is that something that can be harnessed? You've always talked about the need for a new story, something to sort of coalesce around, because
something with gravitational pull.
Something with gravitational pull, if we're going to stick with that, because maybe the old stories have been replaced or are being replaced. Is that a strong enough narrative? If the narrative is we are a species on a spaceship spheroid destined to basically become a united single organism that might have to eventually compete with other organisms in space, is that a strong enough narrative to sort of glom around?
Independence Day. Watch the movie Independence Day. There you go.
That's the new Genesis. That's
That's it.
Yeah.
Will Smith
and on the first day, Jeff Goldblum. Yeah. Interesting.
Well, crap. What was it? It must have been good because I lost it. It must have been profound because I can't think of it.
The best ones are the ones that disappear right away. That's another.
Man.
Take your time.
Well, one thing I did want to say is, because we've been talking about time and repetition, I think in the next episode, it's almost like we're talking about, and maybe I'm leading it a little bit subconsciously, but we're talking about things that are going to happen in the next episodes in our review of the previous episodes. So this idea of repeating, it's a wonderful idea. I think it's wonderful that I noticed on the last viewing, not the time now, but the one I watched when I got here to Spain. One of the big ideas. It was a thing I didn't really understand about how some people would talk about time and repetition and circles and spheres and all that kind of stuff. But um, again, Rust has a soliloquy, I guess, or a monologue where he talks about just that, sort of what we're trying to figure out in this discussion right now. So
Cool.
next episode, he'll bring it up in a really cool way.
Sounds dope. So yes, do you have time for one more question? I wanted to ask you about marriage quickly. What is the message that the show is trying to convey about marriage? Is it a criticism of marriage as an institution, or is it a criticism of people in modern society who are deluding themselves and that marriage is supposed to be something else? And so what do you think it's trying to say, and does your view of marriage jive with that or not?
Having never experienced marriage, I can only talk about it from a theoretical sense, but
Yeah. You're married to your work.
I'm married to my work. And yeah, that's for sure. I think so. There's an idea. This will be the spoiler that I'll give away now, because it seems to we've talked about it enough. So there's an idea in alchemy called the marriage of opposites. Maybe I said it before, but I think the idea of marriage and the idea of a union between competing but equal parts, which turns them into complements, like that is sort of the ideal marriage. And in alchemy, it's called the coincidentia oppositorum, and I forget what the Latin marriage.
That sounded Latin.
Yeah, there's like 3 different terms that kind of hit on that same idea, but I don't know if I was going to idealize it. It would be that. It would be you've got these opposites that pretty much dance with each other to affect creation.
But is that marriage? Does that have to be marriage? Can it be just a union? I mean, why not? Well, let's say Rust and Maggie, they are these sort of beings that naturally gravitate to each other because they're complements in a way. Can they operate in a way that's productive together without having that institution in place?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that the word marriage, as it's used in alchemy, is not. It's only they only say marriage because of kind of using what people know, the vernacular, to get across an idea. But it doesn't have to be a ceremony, sanctified event or state of being. It's more of just the idea you have this sort of intimate interplay, independency, and this then cause and effect cycle going on between these complements. And if you look at sort of Rust and Maggie, they're sort of embodying that idea of marriage. Whereas with Marty and Maggie, there's a skewed relationship. The things are tilted. There's not sort of the equals coming together.
Right.
And so, yeah, I don't know if I was going to try to, that's as much as I can say. I don't, and when I've seen that in different married couples that I've known, it's cool. I mean, it's just a cool thing to witness, no matter where it happens, in whatever relationship it might be. I mean, it could be in a business relationship. It could be in a student mentor relationship. It could be in a best friend relationship. It could be anywhere. It's that idea of these two maybe opposing things coming together to affect something bigger and more beautiful than they are alone.
Right.
So,
yeah. The sum is greater than the parts.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
That's all I got.
All right.
So I like, yeah,
Yeah.
good.
No, I don't really have much of a spiel
Okay.
about it. I don't have a very strong opinion about marriage. I know that might sound weird because I am, but the legal institution aside, I
Mm-hmm.
agree with you. Sometimes it can be convenient to be married because you can get visas easier and stuff like that. But at the same time, on the other side of that, you have a partner who you actually want to be with, and that
Yeah.
makes you better than you were before, and it adds something to your life rather than takes away. Then
Yeah.
it certainly can be, as you were saying, it can be more productive overall. And sometimes that means curbing bad habits that you might have that are then adjusted to accommodate the other person. That's definitely true in my marriage, because I'm much more organized and structured, and my house is very clean, and I have fantastic hygiene because I'm married, and that is a thing that I would, if I were left to my own devices, probably let slide a little bit. I would wash the dishes every 3 days instead of every day, and that seems like a very mundane thing, but because my house is in order, it enforces habits that are good, because then when my house is in order, my mind is in order, and I'm able to sort of exist on a slightly higher plane. And that's just a very simple example. And of course no marriage is perfect, but that's just one of those things that when you're combined with another person who's different from you, who requires that, it sort of causes a slight course adjustment. And that slight course adjustment could be very good or very bad. And if it's a bad course adjustment that is against your nature and prevents you from being happy, then it's doomed to self-destruct. If that is something that is against the fiber of your being, then I think it will destroy you, and it'll have to sort of spiral into the sun and disappear. But if it's not something at the core of your being, like keeping your house clean and washing the dishes and keeping things in order, then you actually realize, oh, I'm kind of glad I have that. You know what I mean? And I'm trying to use that as a simple example, but that's what it's like in my marriage. So as far as the marriage part, legally, it's not really meaningful to me. It's more of a convenience, and I'm married legally, I think, for that reason. But on the other hand, yeah, there's definitely something there in terms of some greater than the parts, sort of.
Yeah, and the legal sort of discipline and rigid term can often draw people away from that mystical amorphous ideal that the marriage is actually pointing to, which is something that goes beyond the name of it, right? Mm-hmm. You think, again, looking at stories in history and myth, you've got pairs of opposites. Again, you've got Isis and Osiris are brother and sister, but they're also married. They're spouses. But I think it seems like that's meant to just elicit the idea of how tightly bound together that they are, and how intertwined that they are, and how they act in concert with one another. And I think it's Plato or Socrates told the story of, in the beginning, human beings were these...
Plato is Socrates, right?
Is he? Is it because
Plato?
One is just
Plato wrote as Socrates.
Okay.
Socrates Socrates didn't write his stories.
Yeah.
Right. Plato wrote stories about Socrates.
Is that the Symposium?
The Symposium and the Phaedo and the Republic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a part of philology that I need to buckle down on to get
Hey,
the names
I've
of
got a review
persons like
too. It
that.
was my major. I should know that stuff, and I'm just trying to reckon back to my college days.
So the story is one of those guys. Uh, his story is that human beings, there were two personalities, and they were joined like, back to back, and um, they were bound together back to back, and they had like four arms and four legs and two heads that were
Mm.
like this, and they were so powerful together that the gods became intimidated by how effective and powerful they were. And so they took one of them, Zeus or somebody, took a wire and cut them apart at the back. But then after that, they just turned around and faced each other and embraced, like in an intense embrace, male to male, female to female, and male to female. And that was the point of that story, was that the attraction towards one another was so powerful and so effective that it threatened the powers that be. They became jealous, they became scared. And so, and that goes into talking about, I mean, look at the combination of Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb, which is, I think, Nut is the sky god, Geb is the earth goddess. And they were so tightly bound to one another that their children got jealous and cut them apart and pushed them apart from each other. So it's a trend, you know, this, and
Yeah.
that mystic idea of marriage, I think, is what ideally marriage is pointing to.
Yeah.
Whereas we can get caught up on the terms and on the legal definitions of it. So
Right. Exactly. But you can look to examples like Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh, who they're not married, they're just partners who have a sort of true understanding clearly of what that means, because they produce things, they're partners, they write together, he directs, and they have kids together, but they're not married because they understand what it actually means. And maybe they're just not, they're both from New Zealand. What's the point in actually legally sealing the deal? There isn't one. There isn't one, really, except for maybe being sort of subject to influences from your friends who might frown on you if you're not, right? So,
and so maybe in the show, Marty and Maggie sort of got, to some degree, caught up on the legal part of it and got tripped into the ditch of that traditional insufficient definition of marriage. Whereas Marty and Russ, they have this wonderful interplay as exemplified by their conversation.
Yeah. I think in most cases, though, go ahead.
And to go way back to your question, I think that might be the point of what we see in the show, is to say you get caught up on the timely definition of almost anything can rip you away from the timeless sufficiency of sort of the baseline mystical high-level long-term view of what you're actually after.
Yeah. Well said, sir. Yeah.
I'm going to take a nap.
That was good.
Okay.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. I think that because we have this sort of thing in front of us that is this institution, it causes more problems than it solves. And a lot of people, because of social pressure, marry the wrong person. That's why most people have disastrous first marriages, you know, because you marry the wrong person, because you're supposed to, and you hate each other. It happens all the time. Most people marry the wrong person. That's why the divorce rate's like 50%. It's ridiculous, because we don't see what we're really doing. We are a bunch of Martys running around, reacting to social stimulus, jumping on the first opposite gendered person who graduates from high school and latching onto them, and then realizing 10 years down the road after a few kids that, oh shit, this person is a dingus.
Rules.
Exactly. All right. Shall we?
I think that was pretty good.
Yeah,
It's
I think we covered a lot of ground.
yeah, I think I did write down some things. Man, the
No,
only
don't need to say it. I can read it in your glasses.
yeah. So there was something that I don't know, man. Let's just end it there. That was good. I think to open up another can of worms would just kind of exhaust the potency of
Right. Yeah, but keep it.
the good experience we've had.
If you want to. Exactly. Well, keep it in mind though for next time, and then we can continue. Hopefully, we'll have. I find that I had a lot of things I wanted to say from last time too, and some of those came out here. So those things that kind of build up after there's another episode, there's more fodder to discuss. I really was worried that after each episode we were going to sort of run dry, but it doesn't seem like that's the case.
I think the universe conspired to give us a rich piece of tofu to keep chewing on.
Right. It's a rubbery tofu. It's almost inedible.
Super duper extra firm.
Yeah, exactly.
It has a penguin consistency.
Yeah, exactly. Raw penguin flesh is very, very rubbery, especially the babies, their little brains.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're wiggling too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Especially if you eat them live, right? You eat them and then, yeah. Brings me back. All right. So yeah, and then after this one, I think we got to have a fountain discussion. We got to do that too.
Oh,
so
man.
we have so much to. We've got like so much to talk about. To put it in modern parlance, like a lot.
And it's almost pumpkin spice latte season, so
it's like
it'll be
it's
super sweet.
Yeah, it's gonna be like so great.
Did you read Dante yet? Or did you listen to Dante?
No,
Okay.
I haven't. I purchased it. I have it. It's in my library. But I'm reading a couple things right now. But I'm right now going through a book about business, and it's interesting, but it's very different than that.
Cool.
Yeah, but I got it, and I got also got another thing I wanted to mention. There's a really good course. Did I mention this to you before? It's called The Story of Human Language.
Sounds good.
Yeah. I want to recommend that to you because it's not a book. It's just a course to listen to. But it kind of ties into the sort of evolution of thought.
Did it talk about that religion is a linguistic disease from the show? Did they mention that?
There's a little bit of that in there, but it's not a major focus. But it's about how it ties into this a little bit. It's about how the way we think. I've listened to it before. I was just listening to it again, and this business book that I'm reading. But it's about how we think that things evolve along the lines of decay. In other words, we always see the previous generation as the better, and so we see the pumpkin spice latte generation as a decayed version of what we used to know. Right? If you look at high school students speaking about things from the 1950s, they look like very articulate geniuses, and if you look at high school students speaking today, they look like morons, and they use like in 95 different senses. But it's actually that's just something that's sort of built into our psyche and the way that we see changes in generations and how we sort of develop, especially under the age of 25 when our sort of prefrontal cortexes are still sort of being sort of settled down. So
chewy.
It's they're still very chewy, very gummy, like a Jolly Rancher, a gummy Jolly Rancher, and it's really interesting because it ties it to language specifically, and so it's a good focus point around that. I think you'd find it very interesting. Recommend it.
Yeah. How much? What time are we at right now?
2 hours and 9 minutes.
Really? Oh man, there were. I guess I just thought of two things from the show that are so dense, but so the language is a disease thing.
Yeah, that's something that I have written down that we didn't focus on at all.
So I thought this was just interesting because I watched the series again
Language is a
a month
virus.
ago.
Yeah.
Language is a virus, or yeah,
He says
religion
language.
is a
Yeah.
linguistic
Sorry.
virus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Religion is. He was talking about the preacher and
Hmm.
how anthropologists believe that the process of being religious and seeing someone talk to you about it is that sort of thing we were talking about before, by
Yeah.
channeling your repression.
So I read, after I watched it again last month, I read where that came from. I was reading Mircea Eliade, and he said Max Muller or Max Mueller. He's a German guy, anthropologist, was the guy that coined that phrase, and it was just cool to see. Oh my God, I've heard this in an amazing show, and here it is. And it was the word nomen and numen. One was name, and then the other was spirit, and that's the linguistic theory that is being discussed in the show. Anyway, that was just kind of cool, and it could be that.
What is the summary of the theory?
I think that somebody just misheard the word, and it sort of took on a life of its own. Nomen is just name in German, and then Numen means something else. It's more of that, I think, numinous, or I didn't read past it other than what Mircea Eliade wrote about it, which was very brief. He just says the linguistic disease sentence. And it was like, oh, that's where it comes from.
That's interesting. Sort of like that episode of SpongeBob when he draws a stick figure version of himself, and then that stick figure version awakens and goes rogue and causes all kinds of chaos in Bikini Bottom. It's dark. Really dark.
It sounds great. It sounds like Mr. Hand in South Park, taking on a life of his own and wrecking stuff.
Whenever people make South Park references, I always feel a little guilty because I never know them, because I never watched South Park.
That's the only one that I know. So
yeah, okay. I never got into it. I find the voices annoying. I think I mentioned that before. It annoys me. I can't get past how it's sort of like, I appreciate the themes and I appreciate the humor and I appreciate the material, but I can't at a very basic level get over the sound of their voies. And it's sort of the same reason why I don't like Ben Shapiro. I don't like his voice. I don't like the sound of his voice. He annoys me. He might have some great ideas, but that's fine. But I can't listen to him speaking.
Yeah.
It's very abrasive. And I always worry that I must be abrasive to some people too. Everyone must be abrasive to others. Who are you abrasive to? Who finds you to be the most annoying thing that they've ever heard? It's got to be some people.
I think before I came to Madrid, slowly over the course of 2017, I realized, oh, this person finds me exactly like you just described. And I didn't realize it until over the course of 2017. I was like, oh my God, I can imagine how I would feel around somebody like that. And to know that I'm the person that makes that other person feel that way is like, oh, Jesus, that's an awful.
But it's unavoidable. So someone said that to you? You are the Ben Shapiro of My Luke Pretty. Is that what they said?
They didn't say it in words. It was more in a passive aggressive attitude, and that's I don't want to go to any.
I hope they're watching this.
Maybe they will. They'll know.
Is it Kathy Bates?
Kathy Bates. God bless her.
I'm going to keep bringing her up, and I'll see if it can somehow become an inside joke that isn't funny.
Can I mention one more line from the show? Yeah. So it was Rust is talking about all the DBs, the dead bodies he's been looking at, and he says when he's looking at all the thousands of faces, he says something about what is owed to society for mutual illusions, and I think that was an important line that would tie into our discussion about criminality and punishment and that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, that part is what really kind of sparked that.
Yeah, what is owed to society for our mutual illusions. So the blinders we put up to, we're going to ignore the way that we act, and we're not going to deal with what we really need to deal with. We're going to keep our mutual illusions. And then the effect of that is murder and violence.
Right.
Not wanting to interact with one another because I want my illusion. I don't want to think. I don't want to know that the way that I act actually compels these and plays a part in these other things. And so the thing that is then owed is blood. And I think that's what Marty has, not Marty, but what Rust realizes. And he's like, okay, this is the reality of where we are. How do I float and move within it?
Right.
So it's just a wonderful line.
Yeah, that was a great line. That was a great line. It made me think of the current Me Too movement, and how do we calculate? Huh. Yeah, it made me think about that. And how do we calculate?
Oh yeah, okay.
How long somebody needs to be in seclusion and apart from out of the spotlight before we can let them back? And what is that? How is that quantified? Is that something we can quantify? Is it something that has to be quantified? Well, take Louis C.K. for example. He had the episode. He admitted he did something wrong, but he couldn't just go up and start doing stand-up again. Does that mean that he has to stop doing stand-up forever? Does that mean that there's a period of time that has to pass before he can come back? What price is he paying? Who is he paying it to? And how do we decide what amount of time is enough? And does that even mean anything?
Yeah.
And is that all just an illusion that we tell ourselves as a way to sort of validate our own assumptions about what appropriate behavior is? It's very convoluted and messy.
And expiate our own guilt, perhaps?
Maybe.
Over whatever?
Maybe. But it just seems arbitrary.
Yeah, 200 years from now, when human beings look back at our attitudes towards these things, what are they going to say? Why did they act this way about these specific things? Or maybe they should have acted with less fervor. Maybe they should have acted with more fervor. I don't know. Yeah, we're probably at the lag end of the moral zeitgeist. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. Don't you think it's sort of interesting to observe and be like, man, human beings, they do these weird things. Yeah, it is. But then you have to try to place yourself within that context and say, all right, so they do these weird things, but what are the things that I do that are weird? Yeah. And how do I know that they're weird? Am I at the tail end of the moral spectrum, or am I trying to move the ball forward, or am I right smack in the middle? And if I am smack in the middle, is it right to be smack in the middle, or should I be trying to move the... It's very difficult to place yourself there when you're trying to also think about how strange it is that people behave the way that they behave, and how the things that are right now will be monstrous in 200 years. Yeah, potentially. It's ridiculous. It's nuts. Maybe stay curious. Yeah. Jolly Ranchers. Chewy like penguins. Chewy like penguin butts. They have tiny little butts. They're microscopic. There's just tiny little penguin butts. Very chewy. Yeah. That's a good one. Great ending point there. Yeah. Better than the beautiful painting tapestry we wove about alchemy and marriage. In fact, I'm just going to cut that whole thing out, that conversation there, and I'm going to just edit penguin butts over and over again, just again and again and again, and cut in a bunch of violent images, and it's going to be great. Great job. Yeah. I'll do it very Tim and Eric style. Don't worry. Cool. I'll have the new episode up shortly, and so you can see that if you like. I want to share it. Man, I hope. I think conversation 2 went very well. I think this one went well. I enjoyed talking to you about it, and I've enjoyed different things. I've enjoyed each one. It's almost like each one is this sort of strange experience where it's like we both step into this sort of bubble boy arena where nothing else is allowed to come in, and we're sort of existing in this space because we both saw this show. We both just watched it. And it's an exploration of the inside of the bubble. It's very weird, but it's quite. Oh my God! Let me out. How did all these penguins get in here? I can't breathe for the penguins. We should have ventilated this bubble before we got into it. It's really hot in here. Jesus. Penguin butts and penguin farts.
All right. Enough of this, sir.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you later.
Cool.
Yeah.
Episode 4. It's a good one.
Episode 4. It's going to be great.